The rig out in the Permian Basin had me locked into a 28-day rotation, and I was on day 19 when something in my gut started turning over like a bad engine. I'm a tool pusher for an oil field services outfit based out of Midland. Been doing this work for 22 years, and I've learned to trust the feeling that something at home isn't right. My wife had passed 3 years back, breast cancer, and it had been just me and my little girl since. Her name is Hannah. She was 9 that summer, and she was the entire reason I got up in the morning. I'd remarried about 14 months before this all happened. Her name was Brielle. I met her at a grief support group in Odessa, of all places. She'd lost her husband to a motorcycle accident, she said, and we connected over the kind of broken thing only widowed people understand. Or that's what I told myself. Looking back, there were signs. Hannah had stopped running to her when I came home. She'd stopped drawing pictures and leaving them on the fridge. The light in her had dimmed somewhere along the way, and I'd written it off as her still missing her mother, still adjusting, still being 9. But on day 19 of my hitch, I called the house at our usual time, 6 in the evening, Texas time, and Brielle answered with that bright voice of hers and said Hannah was already in bed. I said it was only 6 o'clock. She laughed and said Hannah had been tired. She'd had a long day at the pool with the neighbor kids, and she'd asked to turn in early. I said put her on the phone anyway, just for a minute. Brielle's voice changed, just a hair. She said, honey, she's already out cold. Don't wake her. I'll have her call you tomorrow. I sat in my bunk on that rig with my phone in my hand, and I knew. I can't explain it any better than that. I just knew. Hannah had never gone to bed without saying goodnight to me on the phone. Not one single night since I'd been doing this job. She'd wait up. If she fell asleep, Brielle was supposed to wake her. That was the deal. That was the one thing I'd asked. And the pool. We didn't have a pool. The neighbors didn't have a pool. Nobody on our street had a pool. I went to my company man at 4 in the morning. I told him I had a family emergency and I needed to be off the rig by sunrise. He didn't ask questions. He'd worked with me long enough to know I don't cry wolf. He had a helicopter coming in at 7 to swap out a wireline crew, and he put me on it. By noon, I was in my truck on Interstate 20 heading east toward our little house outside of Abilene, and I hadn't told a soul I was coming. I made the drive in just over 2 hours. I should have called the police right then. I should have called my brother. I should have called somebody. But part of me was still hoping I was wrong, hoping I was going to walk in the door and Hannah would come running, and I'd feel like an idiot for spooking myself. Part of me wanted to catch whatever was happening with my own eyes. I pulled into the driveway around 2:30. Brielle's Toyota wasn't there. The house was quiet. Locked. I let myself in with my key and I called out for Hannah, and there was nothing back. Just the hum of the air conditioner and the kitchen clock ticking on the wall above the stove. Brielle had repainted the living room while I was gone. There was a brand new sectional couch I'd never seen, still had the tags on one of the cushions. A flat-screen television on the wall that hadn't been there in May. My credit card statement, which I'd left on the counter to deal with when I got home, had been replaced with a stack of unopened mail. I went to Hannah's room. The bed was made. Not made the way a 9-year-old makes a bed. Made by an adult, the sheets pulled tight, the pillow centered. Her stuffed elephant, the one her mother had given her, was not on the pillow where it always lived. It was sitting on her dresser like a decoration. There were no clothes on the floor. No drawings on her little desk. No books open on the nightstand. The room looked staged. It looked like a model home version of a child's room. I stood there for a full minute, maybe 2, and the fear came up through me like cold water rising in a basement. I called out her name again. Hannah, baby, you home? Nothing. I went out the back door into the yard. We had a half-acre lot, the back end of it overgrown with mesquite and prickly pear, and at the edge of all that, set back against the property line, was an old steel storage shed I'd been meaning to tear down for 2 years. It had been used by the previous owners to store lawn equipment. The door faced away from the house, hidden by the brush. I'd never thought about it because I never went back there. I walked toward it through the high grass. The closer I got, the more I felt my pulse in my teeth. The shed had a heavy chain wrapped around the handle, and a brand new brass padlock that hadn't been there in May. There were no mowers or weed trimmers in our yard. Brielle hired a service. There was no reason on this earth for that shed to be locked. I put my ear to the door. I heard breathing, shallow, fast, wrong breathing, the kind of breathing you hear in the ICU when somebody's body is trying to keep working on fumes, and underneath it, the smallest possible sound. A word. Daddy, I will tell you something, and I want you to understand I'm not exaggerating. I do not remember picking up the rock. I do not remember swinging it. The next clear memory I have is the padlock laying broken in the dirt, and my hands bleeding, and the door swinging open on its hinges with a long, rusted groan. The heat that came out of that shed hit me like opening an oven. It had to be 120 degrees inside, easy. The air smelled like a sick child's room, like sweat and urine and something sour I couldn't place. And there on the concrete floor, curled up on her side on a thin yoga mat, was my baby girl. She was wearing the same pink pajamas she'd had on in the picture Brielle had sent me 4 days earlier. Her hair was matted. Her lips were split and crusted. There was a plastic water bottle next to her with maybe half an inch of cloudy water in the bottom. Her eyes were open and she was looking at me, and she didn't move, didn't sit up, didn't reach for me. She just looked at me like she didn't believe what she was seeing. I went to my knees next to her. I said, baby, it's me, it's Daddy, I'm here. She made a sound, a tiny broken sound, and she said, Daddy, is this real? Her voice was so dry it cracked on the second word. I told her, yes, it's real, it's Daddy, I'm here, I'm taking you home. She closed her eyes and a tear came out the side and slid down through the dirt on her cheek. She said, don't go back to the house, Daddy. Don't go in the basement. I'd already pulled out my phone. I was calling 911. The dispatcher answered, and I told her my address, and I told her my 9-year-old daughter had been locked in a shed for I didn't know how long, and I needed an ambulance, and the sheriff and I needed them now. I told her there might be something else in the basement. She kept me on the line. She told me not to move Hannah, to get her water in sips only, to find a wet cloth and put it on her forehead. I lifted my baby up off that concrete and I carried her into the shade of the live oak in the back of our yard, and I held her against my chest and I rocked her back and forth and I told her over and over, Daddy's got you, Daddy's got you, Daddy's got you. I could feel every bone in her back. She'd lost weight. She didn't have to lose. The first deputy got there in 11 minutes. I know because I kept watching the clock on my phone. He came around the side of the house with his hand on his sidearm, and when he saw me sitting in the grass with her, he stopped, and I watched something go across his face that I will not forget. Pity and anger and the professional thing he had to hold on to keep doing his job. He got down on one knee, and he asked her name, and she whispered Hannah, and he asked her if she knew what day it was, and she shook her head. The ambulance came 2 minutes after that. They took her vitals right there on the lawn. The paramedic, a woman about my age with gray at her temples, looked up at me after she got the IV in, and she said, Sir, your daughter is severely dehydrated, and she's running a fever of 104. She said we need to go right now. I asked if I could ride with her, and she said, of course, get in. The deputy stopped me at the back of the ambulance. He said, Sir, before you go, the basement. What did your daughter mean about the basement? I told him I didn't know. I hadn't been in the house more than 5 minutes. I'd come straight outside when I couldn't find her. He nodded and said, go with your girl, we'll handle the house. I asked him about my wife. He said, do you know where she is? I said, no. He said, is there any reason she might come back here in the next hour or so? I said her car wasn't here when I pulled up, but yes, this is her home, she'll be back. He said, sir, I'm going to need you to give me her full name and date of birth and a description of her vehicle before you leave. I gave him everything. The ride to Hendrick Medical Center in Abilene took 22 minutes. Hannah faded in and out. At one point, she opened her eyes, and she looked at me and she said, is the man gone? I asked her what man. She closed her eyes again before she could answer. The paramedic and I locked eyes over her little body. The paramedic and I locked eyes over her little body. The paramedic shook her head, just slightly, like she was telling me not to push. They took her straight into the pediatric ER. I sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room with my hands still bleeding from the rock, and I shook. I shook so hard, I couldn't hold my phone steady. I called my brother in Lubbock, and I told him what I'd found, and he said he was getting in his truck right then. I called my mother in Tyler, and I couldn't get the words out, and she said, "Honey, what's happened? What's happened?" And I just said, "Hannah," and I started crying in a way I hadn't cried since my wife's funeral. A doctor came out about an hour later, a pediatrician, young, maybe 35, with kind eyes behind his glasses. He sat down next to me and he said, "Sir, your daughter is stable." He said, "She's severely dehydrated. She has heat exhaustion bordering on heat stroke. She has a urinary tract infection that's gone untreated. She has multiple bruises in various stages of healing on her back and upper arms. And she is what we would describe as malnourished." He said, "We are running tests." He said, "The social worker is on her way." He said, "Sir, do you understand what I'm telling you?" I told him I understood. He said, "Sir, when did you last see your daughter healthy?" I told him the truth. I'd seen her in a video call 8 days earlier, and she'd looked thin and quiet, but I thought she was just tired. He nodded and he wrote something down. He said, "Sir, this didn't happen in 3 days. This has been going on for months. I want to tell you what that did to me. I want to be honest. I sat in that plastic chair, and I thought about every single time I'd been on the rig, telling myself she was fine, that Brielle was taking care of her, that I was providing for our family. I thought about the new couch and the flat screen and the credit card statements I hadn't looked at. I thought about Hannah on those video calls, smaller each time, quieter each time. I thought about her stuffed elephant sitting on the dresser like a museum piece. I thought about every father who has ever sat in a chair like that and realized he hadn't been paying attention. And I put my face in my bloody hands and I made a sound I'd never made before. The sheriff's deputy came in about 40 minutes later. The same one from the house. He sat down across from me and he said, "Sir, I need to ask you some questions and I need you to be straight with me." I said yes. He said, "Do you know a man named Trevor Lansing?" I told him I didn't. He said, "Are you sure?" I said I'd never heard the name in my life. He said, "Okay." He said, "Sir, your wife is not at the house. We have her vehicle on a license plate reader, heading east on I-20 about 40 minutes ago. We have a unit looking for her." He said, "Sir, the basement." I asked him what was in the basement. He took a breath. He said, "Sir, your basement has been converted. There are cameras, there is recording equipment, there is a setup down there that we are still processing, and I'm not going to describe it to you right now, but I need you to understand that whatever happened to your daughter is part of something larger, and we need to talk about it in a different setting when you're ready." He said, "Sir, do you know if your wife has been in contact with anyone outside of your household?" I told him she had a sister in Phoenix she talked to, a church group, some friends from her work. She worked part-time at a real estate office in town. He wrote it all down. He said, "Sir, has anyone been staying at the house while you've been gone?" I told him not that I knew of. He said, "Okay." He stood up. He said, "Sir, we're going to find her." He put his hand on my shoulder, and he squeezed, and he walked out. I sat there for a long time. I went into the bathroom and I washed the blood off my hands and I looked at myself in the mirror and I didn't recognize the man looking back. My eyes were sunk in. There was dirt on my collar. I was 42 years old and I looked 60. They let me into Hannah's room around 8 that night. She was sleeping. She had 2 IVs, one in each arm, and a heart monitor, and a little plastic thing on her finger. The bruises were worse than I'd seen in the yard. There were finger-shaped ones on her upper arms and a long one across her lower back, the kind you get from being shoved into something. I sat in the chair next to her bed and I held her hand and I watched her breathe. The nurse came in every hour to check her. Around 10, she opened her eyes and she saw me and she didn't smile, but she squeezed my hand. She said, "You came back. I said, baby, I will always come back. I will always come back. She said, I tried to call you. She said, I tried, Daddy. I asked her what she meant. She told me in pieces over the next 2 days what had been happening in our house. I'm not going to put all of it here. Some of it isn't mine to share. Hannah will tell what she wants to tell when she's older, if she wants to tell it. But I will tell you the shape of it. Brielle had been seeing a man for about 6 months. He'd been coming to the house when I was on the rig. Hannah had walked in on something she shouldn't have seen, back in March, and Brielle had told her she was a liar and a problem, and she'd started locking her in her bedroom in the evenings, then in the closet. Then, when Hannah had tried to use the home phone in the middle of the night to call me, Brielle had pulled the phone out of the wall and slapped her hard enough to split her lip. Hannah had told me about the lip in a video call. She'd said she fell off her scooter. I'd believed her. The shed had started about 3 weeks before I came home. Brielle would put her out there during the day when the man was over. The man, whose name I learned was Trevor Lansing, was a 38-year-old former contractor with 2 prior arrests for offenses I'm not going to name. He had been the one who'd put the lock on the shed. He had been the one who'd put the lock on the shed. He had been the one who'd built whatever was in our basement. He had not, the deputies later told me, ever touched my daughter physically beyond shoving her into the shed twice. But he had taken pictures of her once, asleep on the couch in a way that turned the sheriff's investigator's voice flat when he described it. Brielle had let it happen. Brielle had set it up. Brielle had decided that her relationship with this man was worth more than her stepdaughter's safety. They arrested her at a Holiday Inn Express outside of Tyler the next morning. Trevor was with her. They'd been planning, the investigator said, to leave the state. There were 2 suitcases of cash in the trunk of her Toyota, money she'd been pulling out of our joint account in small amounts for months. She'd also opened 3 credit cards in my name. The new couch, the television, the painting, all on my credit, none of which I'd known about. I want to skip over the next part because there's too much of it. There were 3 weeks where I didn't sleep more than 4 hours at a time. I quit the rig job. My company kept me on payroll for 6 weeks while I figured things out, which was kinder than they had to be. My brother and his wife came down from Lubbock and stayed in our spare bedroom for a month. My mother came up from Tyler and basically ran the kitchen. We pulled Hannah out of her elementary school and enrolled her in a smaller charter school for the fall. We started her in trauma therapy twice a week with a child psychologist in Abilene named Dr. Pace, who, I will say, is one of the best human beings I have ever met. The trial took 11 months to get on the docket. Brielle's attorney tried for a plea deal where she'd serve 6 years and be out in 4. The DA, a woman named Solange Whitcomb, looked across that conference room table and said no. She said your client allowed a man with prior offenses unsupervised access to a 9-year-old child. Your client locked that child in a shed in a Texas summer with no water and no food. Your client took $18,000 from this man's account and used it to redecorate a house she was planning to abandon. Your client is going to trial. I sat in that courtroom every single day. Hannah did not come. Dr. Pace was very firm about that. We made the right call. The jury came back in 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge gave her 32 years. Trevor got 55. There was no possibility of parole on his sentence for the first 30. When the verdict came down, I was sitting in the second row behind the prosecution. Brielle turned around and she looked at me. She didn't say anything. Her face was completely empty. I have thought about that face many times since then. I do not think she ever loved my daughter. I do not think she ever loved me. I think she saw a widowed oil field worker with a paid-off house and a steady income and a quiet little girl who could be controlled. And she decided that was the easiest setup she'd ever find. And when something more exciting came along, my child became an inconvenience. I held it together until I got out to my truck in the parking lot. Then I cried for about 20 minutes, the kind of crying that comes from a place you didn't know you had. And then I drove home. Hannah is 12 now. She'll be 13 in October. She is in 7th grade, and she made the honor roll last semester. She plays first base on her softball team. She is in therapy still, once a week, and she will probably be in some form of therapy for a long time, and I am okay with that, and so is she. She does not sleep with her bedroom door closed. She does not like enclosed spaces. She does not like the smell of mesquite, and we don't have any in our new yard. We moved. I couldn't keep her in that house, and she couldn't have stayed there if I'd tried. We're in a smaller place closer to town now. I work a desk job for the same oil field services company in their Abilene office. No more rotations, no more nights away. I make less money. I do not care. But 6 months after the trial, Hannah and I were in the kitchen one Saturday morning and she was helping me make pancakes. She was telling me about a book she was reading, some fantasy thing with dragons and a girl who fights them. And she stopped in the middle of a sentence and she looked at me and she said, "Daddy, can I ask you something?" I said, "Anything, baby." She said, "Why did you come home that day?" I told her the truth. I told her I'd had a feeling. I told her something in me had known something was wrong, and I'd listened to it, and I'd gotten in my truck, and I'd come. She thought about that for a minute. She turned back to the pancakes. She said, "I'm glad you listened to your feelings." And then she said, real quiet, "I knew you would come. I always knew you would come." I want to say one thing to any father out there who is on the road, on a rig, on a ship, on a deployment, on a long haul, anywhere away from his children. I want to say one thing, and I want you to hear me. If your gut tells you something is wrong at home, you listen to it. You do not explain it away. You do not tell yourself you're being paranoid. You do not let the person on the other end of the phone smooth it over for you. You get in your truck and you drive. You take the leave. You spend the money. You catch the flight. You go. Because there is nothing, and I mean nothing, more important than the small voice of your child saying, "Daddy, is this real?" And there is nothing worse than the version of yourself that didn't show up in time to answer her. I showed up. I almost didn't, but I did. And my baby girl is upstairs right now, asleep in her bed with her door open and the hall light on, and her stuffed elephant on the pillow next to her where it belongs. And I am the man I am because she still calls me Daddy. And I will spend the rest of my life making sure she never has reason to whisper that word into a locked door again. I have thought about that day in the driveway more times than I can count. The moment I sat in my truck with the engine still running, looking at a house I had paid for, knowing in my gut that something was wrong inside it. I could have turned around. I could have told myself I was being paranoid. I could have driven back to a motel in Midland and waited out the rest of my hitch. Nobody would have known. Nobody but Hannah, who would have spent another 9 days on a concrete floor wondering if her daddy was ever coming. What I have learned sitting with this story for 3 years is that every single thing that happened in our lives came from a choice somebody made. Brielle chose a man over a child. Trevor chose to put a lock on a shed instead of walking away from a situation any decent human being would have walked away from. I chose, for 14 months, to believe what was easy instead of paying attention to what was true. My daughter paid the price for all 3 of those choices, and the only thing that saved her was one more choice. Made it 4 in the morning in a bunk on a rig when I decided to trust the small voice in my chest that said, "Go home now." I have come to believe that being a good person is not a feeling you have about yourself. It is the sum of the small, hard choices you make when nobody is watching and nothing is forcing you. Brielle felt like a good person. I am sure of it. She went to church. She smiled at the neighbors. She told herself a story about why what she was doing was acceptable. None of that mattered. Her actions were the only thing that was real, and her actions cost a 9-year-old girl her sense of safety in her own home. I have come to believe that being smart is not about knowing things. It is about being willing to see what is actually in front of you, even when seeing it is going to hurt. I had every piece of evidence I needed for months. A child who had gone quiet. A credit card I didn't check. A wife whose stories didn't quite line up. I chose not to look because looking would have meant blowing up the new life I had built after losing the old one. That was not smart. That was cowardice dressed up as trust. and I have come to believe that real strength is not about what you can endure, it is about what you are willing to disrupt. The strongest thing I have ever done was not breaking that padlock with a rock. It was getting on a helicopter at sunrise without knowing what I was going to find. The willingness to find out, even when the finding might destroy you, is the only kind of courage that actually saves anyone. Hannah is 12 now. She is alive. She is healing, and every morning I make her breakfast and I look at her across the kitchen table and I remember that none of this was guaranteed. I almost wasn't her daddy anymore. I almost let comfort cost me the one person on this earth I was put here to protect. Pay attention to your people. Listen to your gut. Show up.